The main thing that we've learned through our study of the book of Judges has been that Israel was both unable and unwilling to keep the covenant. Remember, God called them out of that place, out of the land of bondage, to go and follow him. And they should have kept his covenant from there. It should have been fairly easy to be grateful. They saw so many miracles and experienced so many things that no one else had ever experienced. They should have been able to at least keep him in mind, but they really weren't, and they didn't want to. If they had peace too long, they started to forget the covenant, and then he punished them with foreign occupation, putting them into the hands of their enemies. Then they'd cry out, and he'd send a deliverer, a judge, and that judge would defeat the enemy, peace. They'd start the whole process all over again, go back into their sin. And when it came right down to it, they were really no different, they were really no better than the Gentiles who lived around them. It says several times, we talked about that passage last time, that they did what was right in their own eyes. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And that's what we learned with the story last time about Micah and the priest. That was Judges 17 and 18. You remember the priest was looking for a place, right? He's a Levite and he wants to make something of himself in the world. And so he starts walking around looking for any place he could use his status as a priest to make something out of his life, make something of himself. And Micah wants to be religious enough that God will do him good, that God will bless him. And so Micah builds this shrine, and he's got the idols in it, and he runs across this priest. He had his own priest installed he had his own son installed as his priest, but then he runs across his Levite, and he says, hey, this is the real deal. I know that if I can get this guy to come back with me, then God will definitely bless me. And so he makes a deal with him. He'll give him some money and take care of his basic needs. And the priest hears that and he agrees, right? And in short, basically they were using God to accomplish their own purposes. They were using religion to get the things that they wanted instead of worrying about his glory more than anything. And so the priest goes home with him and everything's going okay until one day the Danites come. Remember, there was a big army of soldiers, like 600 guys. And they know that the priest is like a pipeline to God. So they go and they get him and they take him with them. And there's nothing Micah can do about it. And the priest is real happy to go because, hey, it's a raise. Now, I'm not going to be just serving one guy anymore. I'm not going to be just paid by one guy anymore. I'm going to be able to serve an entire family and get paid by an entire family. And so everyone was doing what was right in his own eyes, and everyone was using God for their own purposes. But religion wasn't the only place where the Israelites did what they wanted. That was just one thing. They said, hey, we can use our religion in a way that seems right to us. But there was another major area of life that they did this in, and we're going to read that tonight. Actually, we're going to read Judges 19, 20, and 21. And as we do, before we get into it, I want to remind you of what Jesus said is the greatest commandment. What is the greatest commandment? He says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind. And the second greatest commandment is what? You shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these things. So God expected the people to love him more than anything else, right? And he commanded the people to love each other like they loved themselves. And we've already seen, that was the story of Micah, is that they failed to love God with all their heart, mind, strength, and soul. They saw him as a way to get rich, or at least a way to survive. It wasn't out of love or respect of his glory or worship or awe, but it was out of usefulness. God was useful. Well, we're going to see tonight that they didn't love each other either. They failed on both counts. Love the Lord your God, love your neighbor as yourself. They failed on both. And before we get into it, this is chapter 19. I want to say just a few things. First, what we're about to read is a very long story, 19, 20, and 21. But we have to take them all together because it is one story. Okay, and I know it's a lot of reading, but first, there won't be any commentary. There won't be much commentary until we get to the very end. Also, I'm going to be reading out of the New Living Translation instead of the ESV because it's really not any different and it's a lot easier to understand. In my opinion, it's a more conversational translation. It's easier to just listen to it. And I don't want to get focused on the little details. I want to look at the big story as a whole. I just want you to listen to the story and hear it and understand what the story is, okay? So I'm not going to, if they repeat a lot of town names, which they do, I'm not going to read those. I'm just going to read through and tell the story, okay? The other thing I want you to know about this is that, in my opinion, this may be the worst, most horrific story in all the Scripture. There just really isn't anything worse than what we're about to read. So it might not be appropriate for everybody. It might not be appropriate for little kids. Some of the stuff that happens in it is awful. The last thing I want to say, just as a way of when we go into this, especially at the end, there were some questions about, well, what does God think about this? Well, the thing is that these verses, these chapters, aren't telling us what God thinks about it. Everything that's here in 19, 20, and 21 is just a fact. This is what happened. This is what they did. Okay, and it's not a commentary on God's endorsement. It's not meant to justify anybody or tell us this is how things should happen or it's okay if these things happen. In fact, it's just the opposite. The whole point of the story is to show us that this is what happens when people do what's right in their own eyes. This is what the heart of man is. Okay, so keep that in mind. God said to love him more than anything else and love each other like you love yourselves. But everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And this is what it looks like when they do. So let's start in the New Living Translation. Judges chapter 19, verse 1. In those days, Israel had no king. There was a man from the tribe of Levi living in a remote area of the hill country of Ephraim. One day he brought home a woman to be his concubine, but she became angry with him and returned to her father's home. After about 4 months, her husband set out to speak personally to her and persuade her to come back. He took with him a servant and a pair of donkeys. When he arrived at his father's house, or her father's house, her father saw him and welcomed him. Her father urged him to stay a while, so he stayed 3 days, eating, drinking, and sleeping there. On the 4th day, the man was up early, ready to leave. But the woman's father said to his son-in-law, "Have something to eat before you go." So the two men sat down together and had something to eat and drink. Then the woman's father said, "Please stay another night, enjoy yourself." The man got up to leave, but his father-in-law kept urging him to stay, so he finally gave in and stayed the night. On the morning of the 5th day, he was up early again, ready to leave. And again, the woman's father said, "Have something to eat. Then you can leave later this afternoon." So they had another day of feasting. Later, as the man and his concubine and servant were preparing to leave, his father-in-law said, "Look, it's almost evening. Stay the night and enjoy yourself. Tomorrow you can get up early and be on your way." But this time the man was determined to leave. So he took his 2 saddled donkeys and his concubine and headed in the direction of, I'm going to say it, Jebus. It's Jerusalem later. They call it that because it's the place where the Jebusites live. It was late in the day when they neared the place, and the man's servant said to him, "Let's stop at this Jebusite town and spend the night there." "No," his master said, "we can't stay in this foreign town where there are no Israelites. Instead, we'll go on to Gibeah." "Come on, let's try to get as far as Gibeah or Ramah, and we'll spend the night in one of those towns." So they went on. The sun was setting as they came to Gibeah, a town in the land of Benjamin. So they stopped there to spend the night. They rested in the town square, but no one took them in for the night. You know that's a big deal, right? Custom dictated. You can't just let strangers stay in the square. And I want you to think about the story of Sodom and Gomorrah while we read through this, because it has a lot of similarities. They were supposed to go, if you saw a stranger like that, you're supposed to go help him, but it goes out of the way to say no one did. No one took them in for the night. And they couldn't just travel, wild animals, bandits, stuff like that. Verse 16, that evening an old man came home from his work in the fields. He was from the hill country of Ephraim, but he was living in Gibeah, where the people were from the tribe of Benjamin. When he saw the travelers sitting in the town square, he asked them where they were from and where they were going, and the man answered and said, no one has taken us in for the night, even though we have everything we need. We have straw and feed for our donkeys and plenty of bread and wine for ourselves. The old man said, well, you're welcome to stay with me. I'll give you anything you might need, but whatever you do, don't spend the night in the square. So he took them home with him and fed the donkeys and washed their feet. They ate and drank together. While they were enjoying themselves, a crowd of troublemakers, worthless men, the ESV says, Hebrew is sons of Belial, surrounded the house. They began beating at the door and shouting to the old man, bring out the man who is staying with you so that we can know him. The old man stepped outside to talk to them. No, my brothers, don't do such an evil thing, for this man is a guest in my house, and such a thing would be shameful. Here, take my virgin daughter and this man's concubine. I'll bring them out to you, and you can abuse them and do whatever you like. But don't do such a shameful thing to this man. But they wouldn't listen to him. So the Levite took hold of his concubine and pushed her out the door. The men of the town abused her all night, taking turns until morning. Finally, at dawn, they let her go. At daybreak, the woman returned to the house where her husband was staying. She collapsed at the door of the house and lay there until it was light. When her husband opened the door to leave, there lay his concubine with her hands on the threshold. He said, "Get up, let's go." But there was no answer. So he put her body on his donkey and took her home. When he got home, he took a knife and cut her body into 12 pieces. Then he sent one piece to each tribe throughout all the territory of Israel. Everyone who saw it said, "Such a horrible crime has not been committed in all the time since Israel left Egypt. Think about it. What are we going to do? Who's going to speak up?" Chapter 20. Then all the Israelites were united as one man. The entire community assembled in the presence of the Lord, the leaders of all the people and all the tribes of Israel. 400,000 warriors armed with swords took their positions in the assembly of the people of God. Word soon reached the land of Benjamin that the other tribes had gone up to Mizpah where they met. The Israelites then asked how this terrible crime had happened. The Levite, the husband of the woman who had been murdered, said, "My concubine and I came to spend the night in Gibeah, a town that belongs to the people of Benjamin. That night, some of the leading citizens surrounded the house, planning to kill me. And they raped my concubine until she was dead. So I cut her body into 12 pieces and sent the pieces throughout the territory assigned to Israel. For these men have committed a terrible and shameful crime. Now then, all of you, the entire community of Israel, must decide here and now what should be done about this." And all the people rose to their feet in unison and declared, "None of us will return home. No, not even one of us. Instead, this is what we will do to Gibeah. We'll draw lots to decide who will attack it. 1/10 of the men from each tribe will be chosen to supply the warriors with food, and the rest of us will take revenge on Gibeah of Benjamin for the shameful thing they've done in Israel." So, all the Israelites were completely united, and they gathered together to attack the town. The Israelites sent messengers to the tribe of Benjamin, saying, "What a terrible thing has been done among you. Give up those evil men, those troublemakers from Gibeah, so we can execute them and purge Israel of this evil," which was the thing they were supposed to do. But the people of Benjamin would not listen. Instead, they came from their towns and gathered at Gibeah to fight the Israelites. In all, 26,000 of their warriors, armed with swords, arrived in Gibeah to join the 700 elite troops who lived there. Among Benjamin's elite troops, 700 were left-handed, which we talked about doesn't necessarily mean they weren't right-handed. Rather, they were trained with both hands, so you know they were very skilled. And each of them could sling a rock and hit a target within a hair's breadth without missing. Israel had 400,000 experienced soldiers armed with swords, not counting Benjamin's warriors. Before the battle, the Israelites went to Bethel and asked God which tribe should go first to attack the people of Benjamin. The Lord answered, Judah is to go first. So the Israelites left early the next morning and camped near Gibeah. Then they advanced toward Gibeah to attack the men of Benjamin. But Benjamin's warriors, who were defending the town, came out and killed 22,000 Israelites on the battlefield that day. But the Israelites encouraged each other and took their positions again at the same time, the same place they had fought the previous day. For they had gone up to Bethel and wept in the presence of the Lord until evening. They had asked the Lord, should we fight against our relatives from Benjamin again? And the Lord said, go out and fight against them. So the next day they went out again to fight against the men of Benjamin. But the men of Benjamin killed another 18,000 Israelites, all of whom were experienced with the sword. Then all the Israelites went up to Bethel and wept in the presence of the Lord and fasted until evening. They also brought burnt offerings and peace offerings to the Lord. The Israelites went up seeking direction from the Lord. In those days, the Ark of the Covenant of God was in Bethel, and Phinehas, son of Eleazar and grandson of Aaron, was the priest. The Israelites asked the Lord, should we fight against our relatives from Benjamin again, or should we stop? The Lord said, go. Tomorrow I will hand them over to you. Now that part's a little bit confusing, and I'm still not sure I completely understand it. The thing that makes the most sense to me, though, is think about, like we talked about at the beginning with Micah and the Danites, how superstitious they were and how they were using God to get what they wanted. And so the first two times they go, it's not that they're not serious, it's that they're not treating God properly. And by the third time, though, they've been humbled. And now you see that they're not only weeping, but they're offering sacrifices and burnt offerings and peace offerings. And they're humbled. They're repentant in the way that they're doing this. And God tells them, go. Tomorrow I will hand them over to you. So, verse 29, the Israelites set an ambush all around Gibeah. They went out on the third day and took their positions at the same place as before. When the men of Benjamin came out to attack, they were drawn away from the town. And as they had done before, they began to kill the Israelites. About 30 Israelites died in the open fields and along the roads, one leading to Bethel and the other leading back to Gibeah. Then the warriors of Benjamin shouted, we're defeating them as we did before. But the Israelites had planned in advance to run away, so that the men of Benjamin would chase them along the roads and be drawn away from the town. When the main group of Israelite warriors reached Bel Tamar, they turned and took up their positions. Meanwhile, the Israelites hiding in ambush to the west of the town jumped up to fight. There were 10,000 elite troops who advanced against the city. And the fighting was so heavy that Benjamin didn't realize the impending disaster. So the Lord helped Israel defeat Benjamin. And that day the Israelites killed 25,100 of Benjamin's warriors, all of whom were experienced swordsmen. Then the men of Benjamin saw that they were beaten. The Israelites had retreated. So we're kind of going back and telling the first part of the story. The Israelites had retreated from Benjamin's warriors in order to give those hiding in ambush more room to maneuver against Gibeah. Then those who were in hiding rushed in from all sides and killed everyone in the town. They had arranged to set up a large cloud of smoke from the town as a signal. When the Israelites saw the smoke, they turned and attacked Benjamin's warriors. By that time, Benjamin's warriors had killed about 30 Israelites, and they shouted, we're defeating them as we did in the first battle. But when the warriors of Benjamin looked behind them and saw the smoke rising into the sky from every part of the town, the men of Israel turned and attacked. At this point, the men of Benjamin became terrified because they realized disaster was close at hand. So what they had done was they had gone up to the gates. The men came out of the city, started to kill them, and then the chase started. The Israel started to run off, and the Benjamites chased them, left the town empty. Well, guess what? We've got a whole bunch more Israelites sitting over here in the bushes. They go into the town and destroy it, set it on fire, and now the Benjamites are stuck between them, so they have to flee. So they turned around, verse 42. They turned around and fled before the Israelites toward the wilderness, but they couldn't escape the battle, and the people who came out of the nearby towns were also killed. The Israelites surrounded the men of Benjamin and chased them relentlessly, finally overtaking them east of Gibeah. That day, 18,000 of their strongest warriors died in battle. The survivors fled into the wilderness toward the rock of Rimmon, but Israel killed 5,000 of them along the road. They continued the chase until they'd killed another 2,000. So that day, the tribe lost 25,000 strong warriors armed with swords, leaving only 600 men who had escaped to this place in Rimmon, where they lived for 4 months. And the Israelites returned and slaughtered every living thing in all the towns, the people, the livestock, and everything they found. They also burned down all the towns they came to. But here's something they didn't realize. Before the battle started, chapter 21, the Israelites had vowed, "We will never give our daughters in marriage to a man from the tribe of Benjamin." Now the people went to Bethel and sat in the presence of God until evening, weeping loudly and bitterly. "O Lord God of Israel," they cried out, "why has this happened in Israel? Now one of our tribes is missing from Israel." Early the next morning, the people built an altar and presented their burnt offerings and peace offerings on it. Then they said, "Who among the tribes of Israel did not join us at Mizpah when we held our assembly in the presence of the Lord?" At that time, when they did that, they had taken a solemn oath in the Lord's presence, vowing that anyone who refused to come would be put to death. And see, it wasn't like us where you have a choice to go. They were one family. And so they said, "Look, we're having a meeting, and if you don't come, you're going to die." Well, then in verse 6, the Israelites felt sorry for their brother Benjamin and said, "Today one of the tribes has been cut off. How can we find wives for the few men who remain, since we have sworn by the Lord not to give them to our daughters in marriage?" So they asked, as they asked a minute ago, "Who among the tribes didn't join us?" And they discovered that no one from Jabesh Gilead had attended the assembly. For after they counted all the people, no one from that place was present. So the assembly sent 12,000 of their best warriors with orders to kill everyone there, including women and children. "This is what you are to do," they said. "Completely destroy all the males and every woman who's not a virgin." Among the residents, they found 400 young virgins who had never been with the man, and they brought them to the camp at Shiloh in the land of Canaan. The Israelite assembly sent a peace delegation to the remaining people of Benjamin who were living at the rock of Rimmon. Then the men of Benjamin returned to their homes, and the 400 women of Jabesh Gilead who had been spared were given to them as wives. But there were not enough women for all of them, because there were 600 of them. The people felt sorry for Benjamin because the Lord had made this gap among the tribes of Israel. So the elders of the assembly asked, "How can we find wives for the few who remain, since the women of the tribe of Benjamin are dead? There must be heirs for the survivors so that an entire tribe of Israel is not wiped out. But we cannot give them our own daughters in marriage because we've sworn with a solemn oath that anyone who does this will fall under God's curse." Then they thought of the annual festival of the Lord held in Shiloh. They told the men of Benjamin who still needed wives, "Go and hide in the vineyards. When you see the young women of Shiloh come out for their dances, rush out from the vineyards, and each of you take one of them home to the land of Benjamin to be your wife. And when their fathers and brothers come to us in protest, we'll tell them, 'Please be sympathetic. Let them have your daughters, for we didn't find wives for all of them when we destroyed Jabesh Gilead, and you're not guilty of breaking the vow since you didn't actually give your daughters to him in marriage.'" So the men of Benjamin did as they were told. Each man caught one of the women as she danced in the celebration and carried her off to be his wife. They returned to their own land, and they rebuilt their towns and lived in them. Then the people of Israel departed by tribes and families, and they returned to their own homes. In those days, Israel had no king. All the people did whatever seemed right in their own eyes. So that's the story. That's how the book of Judges ends. When we continue, we won't go into Ruth because it's actually not the next. We'll go into Samuel where we pick up right here. Start looking at how they transfer into a king, because in those days they had no king and all the people did whatever seemed right in their own eyes. They lived by their hearts, is what he's saying. And they set their own morals. They had their own standard for what was right and what was wrong. And I think we can immediately see some practical application for us, or at least some relevance to ourselves here. Where in our time it's celebrated, it's applauded for people to not live by what God has said is right, or to stay away from what God has said is wrong, but instead they call evil good and they call good evil. In our time and in our culture, people are encouraged and applauded for living by what they think is right in their own eyes. And it's not just the people of the world, it's also churches. A church is progressive. A church is considered more friendly or whatever if they can just see that the things in the Bible are archaic, or that they're symbolic, or that they're not supposed to be applied to everybody today. And so if you can just adjust what you believe a little, and if you can just change how you think a little and be a little more tolerant toward the world, then you'll be more acceptable. In these churches, well, they want to do what's right in their own eyes. And this is how they become. They're people who have a form of godliness, but they deny its power. And it should concern us. It should concern us as a church, as people who live in this culture, but it should also concern us as people who are in danger of the same thing, of doing the same thing, or who could be in danger of doing the same thing. I'm thinking specifically about what Jeremiah said. It's a verse we've quoted a couple times in the past couple weeks. It's from Jeremiah 17:9. The heart is deceitful above all things. Think about what that means. The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it? What's it mean that the heart is deceitful? Who does it lie to? Well, it lies to you, right? If your heart is deceitful, it's something that's lying to you. It's lying about what's right and about what's wrong. It's something that lies to you about who you really are. It lies to you about how you actually stand in front of God. I'm okay. This will be all right. I think about Eve in the garden. Was her heart lying to her when she saw that the fruit was good? It was pleasing to the eye. I think about Cain when he was so full of rage. What he wanted to do was kill his brother. Well, that comes from his heart, right? Hatred comes from your heart. It was his heart that deceived him and said that it would be better if his brother were dead. I think about Moses when he was angry with Israel and he struck the rock. It was his heart that led him astray. It deceived him. God didn't say strike the rock, but Moses, led by his heart, did it. Saul, when he was told to go and wipe out everything, and he said, well, but I kept the animals alive for God's sake. We can offer them as sacrifices. His heart had deceived him. When David saw Bathsheba, his heart deceived him. It's the thing that will happen, in Matthew 7, where the people say, but Lord, 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 didn't we do these things in your name. And they're going to be so surprised that they're rejected. Why? Because their hearts have deceived them. You see, the trouble with doing what seems right is that it seems right. That's the whole problem with it, is that their hearts have deceived them. They actually think that what they're doing is a good thing. They think that what they're doing is God's will. They think that it's a right thing to do. But the heart is desperately sick. That's what these Israelites found out. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Everyone did according to what was in his own heart to do, according to what he thought was right instead of what God said was right. And when everyone does what's right in their own eyes, sin abounds. The heart is desperately sick. In other words, it's broken and you can't trust it. God had warned them before they ever started this whole campaign of going into the promised land. Do not say in your heart that it's because of your righteousness that God has brought you into this place. For you are a stubborn people. They are stiff-necked and rebellious. Don't kid yourselves. Don't lie to yourselves. Don't listen to the deceptions of your desperately sick heart that the reason that you're allowed to come into the promised land and the reason that you're allowed to displace the people who are there is because you're so righteous and good. Because in reality, you're no different than the people who are leaving. No different than the people that I'm judging through you. And they proved their point. They proved his point with the story, didn't they? The fact that Israel's heart is wicked and beyond cure is on display in Judges 19, 20, and 21. Did you catch the similarities with Sodom? You remember the story of Sodom, right? The two angels go down into the city and they're prepared to destroy it. And Abraham had stood up there at the top of the mountain with God and he was saying, yeah, but if you could just find a few righteous people, will you spare the city? And God says, yeah, if there are a few righteous, I'll spare the city. Well, he didn't find them. These two angels go down into the city and they stay at the square just like the other men. And they get called into Lot's house to go stay. And while they're there, the men surround the place and they say, hey, bring them out so we can know them. This is Sodom part 2. The difference is that God didn't allow the Sodomites to do what they wanted to do, but he let Israel's plans play itself out to the very end. And when it came right down to it, the Israelites were no different and no better than the Sodomites. What a shock it must have been to realize that they were the same. These people who said in their hearts, God has allowed me to do this because I'm so much better. They find out that if you rewind time and go back to before this whole thing with the promised land ever started, nothing has changed. The people who came in are no more progressed, no more righteous, no more just. You are the same. It might have been better for that Levite to go to a Gentile city after all. It certainly wouldn't have been any worse. But it wasn't just those men in the city, was it? It wasn't just the men who surrounded the house that were the problem. You will be hard-pressed to find a good guy or a hero in any part of this story. The Levite, the priest, and his host, what did they do? Soon as the men start banging on the door, he says, no, don't do this to this man. Take my daughter instead. Take the woman instead. They're doing whatever they can to save their own skin. And I guess you could make a case that that's understandable, if wrong, but understandable. But there's not even a hint of any kind of concern for her the next day, is there? He opens the door and there she... I mean, first of all, why did you wait until daylight? And she's at the door and you didn't even open it. And then when he does Come on, get up, let's go. I mean, is there no love? Isn't the commandment that you love your neighbor as yourself? And this woman it's his concubine, but the word used for him is her husband. He said at the beginning of the story that she had gone off to be with her father, and he cared so much that he went and he spoke kindly. He spoke to her heart. But where is that love now? And then the Benjamites. I mean, we're talking about how we're trying to find a hero in this story, right? The Benjamites fought to the death, to nearly being annihilated, to defend who? Those guys? They were so fixed on kin, on being, these are our people, that no matter what they do, we're going to stand up and fight for them. Rapists and murderers. But that was the climate. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. It doesn't matter that God said that this is punishable. It doesn't matter it says drive out the evil among you and don't let anything take root there. This is what we think is right, and so this is what we're going to do. And then you have even the other men, the rest of Israel, who raised up and fought against them. You find that they're really not heroes either, are they? Because they'd made this vow. And they couldn't get out of the vow. They said, well, we're not going to let any of our kids marry any of their daughters. And so what'd they do? They realized that was a mistake. And so instead of doing what was right or finding another way to be right, they said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to go steal some more of these other women. And when the fathers complain, we'll tell them just to back off and let it be. No hero at all in the story. But before we shake our heads in judgment, we shouldn't forget that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Our hearts are deceitful and desperately sick too. Right? The heart is deceitful and desperately sick. And we can say that we would never do any of the things that these people did. It's easy to say from here, right? But even with that, you still have to see things from God's perspective. And what's he say? Whoever keeps the whole law but fails in one point has become guilty of breaking all of it. You keep everything but stumble at just the smallest point, well, you've become a transgressor. And God doesn't categorize it by, well, this is a sinner and this is a worse sinner and this is the worst sinner. He just has people who have sinned and people who haven't. And if you have sinned, if you have transgressed, you're over here. And Jesus said, you've heard it said, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. But I say, whoever is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. He puts murderers and haters in the same category. You've heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say, everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already done it in his heart. And so we might say that we've never murdered, but can we say we've never hated? Can we say that we have never lusted or coveted or done any other kind of sinful thing? We have no heroes either. There are no heroes in our camp because none of us have overcome our own hearts. The heart, your heart, my heart, your parents' heart, your spouse's heart, your children's hearts, your grandchildren's hearts are wicked and deceitful and beyond cure. In other words, there is no amount of law, no amount of religion, no amount of anything that's going to fix it. We are the same as the Israelites and the Canaanites. Is that true? Are we the same as the Canaanites, as the Jebusites, as the people that Israel was sent to go and push out? And we're the same as those Israelites who did it. Jesus says what comes out of a person is what defiles him. This is how you know what's in your heart. For from within, out of the heart of man, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, foolishness. Does even one of those words, can even one of those words be applied to you ever? I would say that for all of us, many of those words can be applied regularly. He says, all these evil things come from within, and they defile a person. So it's pretty hopeless, right? And there is no hope. The heart is deceitful above everything else, and it's beyond cure. Well, I want you to notice, there at the end, very last sentence in Judges, what is the reason given for why Israel did the things they did? Judges 21:25. What is the reason that they did it? In those days, they had no king. In those days, Israel had no king. That's why everyone did what was right in his own eyes. The problem was that there was no one to unite them. There was no one to keep them under control. And even when they did get a king, how did that go? Well, it was better. Politically, it was better for sure. Was it any better spiritually? I mean, it was more uniform. But they were still the same. Their hearts were still as wicked and broken as they ever were. They were still as far from a cure as they ever were. But their kings were just like their judges. Their kings point to someone who's better. There was no king, and that's why everyone did what was right in his own eyes. But there's a king who's coming. And when he comes, he changes our hearts. When he comes, he takes our hearts of stone and gives us hearts of flesh. When he comes, he takes the law and puts it on our hearts so that we now obey. He makes us to love God with all of our hearts, with all of our minds, with all of our soul, with all of our strength. How does he do that? We love him because he first loved us. And because his Spirit is poured on us without limit. And that fruit overflows. We are the work of his hands. This is what our King does for us. He makes us to love God. And then he causes us to love each other like we love ourselves. And that's why when Paul is preaching in the New Testament, when he's writing those commands and he's saying, consider others as more important than yourselves, that's not too tall a command. It is too tall for the broken heart that is beyond cure. But it is not too much for the heart that has been converted by Christ, for the new creation that is the handiwork of God. And so, from the book of Judges, we see the hope that's only found in Christ. We're forced to look forward to him. We see that he's the Savior that every judge hoped to be. And that when we go into Samuel, we'll see that he's the King that every king hoped to be. Father, we thank you for this little type, for this blueprint. We see what life is like for Israel when they had no king. We see that it didn't change with any man, but we know that it does with you. And so, like it says in the psalm, who is this King of glory? Open the doors that he may come in. You have deserved, you have purchased your people. And you are our only hope. So may we trust in you. May we look to you, not just in salvation, but in everything after. May we grow in grace and knowledge of you, and you be glorified. And it's only because of you that we can pray. And in you we expect, we know that God will give us the good things that we need. Amen.